The autumn leaves drifted past Dr. J. Allen Hynek's office at Northwestern University, each one catching the late afternoon light in its spiral descent toward the quadrangle below. Inside his sanctuary of astronomical journals and celestial calculations, Hynek worked methodically through his correspondence, the steady scratch of his fountain pen providing a familiar counterpoint to the distant murmur of students crossing the campus. The telephone's sharp ring shattered the September tranquility at precisely 4:23 p.m. Hynek reached for the heavy black receiver, expecting perhaps a colleague from the observatory or his wife with a gentle reminder about dinner plans. Instead, Colonel Harold Watson's voice crackled across the long-distance line from Wright Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, carrying that particular blend of military precision and careful courtesy that immediately commanded attention. The colonel spoke of unusual aerial phenomena, of a newly reorganized Air Force investigation, and of the need for scientific perspective on what newspapers had sensationally dubbed flying saucers. Watson's approach impressed Hynek. The military officer distinguished between believers and debunkers, seeking instead investigators who would follow evidence wherever it might lead. Through his window, the golden afternoon light had begun to fade, and the first street lamps flickered to life across the campus. Hynek found himself contemplating the transition from day to night, that liminal moment when familiar landscapes transformed into something subtly alien. The colonel described hundreds of cases from professional observers, military pilots, airline crews, radar operators, whose credibility proved difficult to dismiss. The scope suggested something more systematic than random delusion or media hysteria. If even a small percentage of these reports proved genuinely anomalous, the implications would be profound for someone who had spent his career studying the orderly mechanics of the cosmos. Watson explained that the work would involve reviewing classified case files, applying scientific methodology to witness reports, and helping separate genuine unknowns from conventional misidentifications. The phrase resonated with something deep in Hynek's scientific conscience. In his years studying binary stars and stellar spectra, he had learned that the universe consistently revealed layers of complexity beneath apparent simplicity. Perhaps these aerial phenomena deserved the same careful attention he gave to cosmic mysteries. Hynek's initial response reflected his natural skepticism. In his experience, most unexplained observations became quite explainable once sufficient data was gathered. The colonel welcomed exactly that kind of rigor, emphasizing the military's need for someone who understood both the science and the human factors involved in unusual sightings. The conversation revealed the careful balance the Air Force sought to maintain. They needed scientific credibility without predetermined bias, methodical investigation without dismissive arrogance. Watson seemed to understand that legitimate scientific inquiry required walking the delicate line between skepticism and curiosity. After hanging up, Hynek remained in his chair as darkness gradually claimed his office. The campus settled into its evening rhythm of closing libraries and departing faculty, but his mind turned to questions of evidence and methodology. His astronomical work had taught him that the universe held mysteries that revealed themselves only to patient, systematic observation. The decision, when it crystallized in his thoughts, felt as inevitable as celestial mechanics. Here was an opportunity to apply the same rigorous scientific approach that had served him well in stellar research to a phenomenon that might, however improbably, represent something genuinely unknown. Hynek considered the potential risks to his academic reputation. Association with flying saucer investigations could easily damage a career built on serious astronomical research. Yet the colonel's emphasis on scientific methodology and professional discretion suggested this wouldn't be a carnival of sensationalism, but a legitimate attempt to understand puzzling phenomena. The astronomer's mind worked through the logical framework he would apply to such investigations. Witness reliability, environmental conditions, equipment limitations, psychological factors, all the variables that could transform a mundane event into an apparently extraordinary one. Most cases would undoubtedly yield to conventional explanation, but those that didn't would require careful analysis. As the last students crossed the darkened quadrangle below, Hynek made his decision. The next morning, he would call Colonel Watson and accept the consulting position with Project Blue Book. The work would demand maintaining his academic responsibilities while occasionally traveling to Wright Patterson to examine classified reports of aerial mysteries. The choice reflected both scientific duty and personal curiosity. If unusual objects were indeed operating in American airspace with capabilities that defied conventional understanding, then qualified scientists had an obligation to investigate rather than dismiss. The truth, whatever it might prove to be, deserved serious attention from serious minds. Outside his window, the first stars began to appear in the clear Ohio sky, distant suns whose light had traveled incredible distances to reach human observation. Perhaps some mysteries, Hynek reflected, were meant to be studied rather than explained away. Chapter 2. Behind Classified Doors. The October morning air carried the crisp promise of winter as Hynek's train pulled into Dayton Union Station. Wright Patterson Air Force Base sprawled across the Ohio landscape like a small industrial city, its runways and hangars extending toward horizons marked by control towers and radar installations. The astronomer had traveled from the ivy-covered tranquility of Northwestern to this epicenter of military aviation research, carrying only a briefcase and an increasingly complex mixture of scientific curiosity and professional caution. Colonel Watson met him at the main gate, a lean man in his 40s whose bearing suggested both military discipline and intellectual flexibility. The security checkpoint required forms, photographs, and the strange ritual of surrendering his civilian identity for a temporary badge marked with classifications he didn't yet understand. The base operated under layers of secrecy that reminded Hynek of his wartime consulting work, but with an additional weight of ongoing mystery rather than defined enemy objectives. Their destination proved to be a nondescript building designated T2, where Captain Edward Rappelt waited in an office that embodied military efficiency without bureaucratic sterility. Charts covered one wall, marked with pins and colored threads that suggested systematic analysis rather than random data collection. Filing cabinets lined another wall. Their labels indicated geographical regions and date ranges that spanned several years of accumulated reports. Rappelt impressed Hynek immediately. The captain spoke with the precision of an engineer and the caution of someone who had learned to distinguish between genuine puzzles and easily explained mistakes. His approach to unidentified aerial phenomena reflected neither believer enthusiasm nor debunker dismissal, but rather the methodical curiosity of a professional investigator confronting an unusual problem. The captain explained Project Blue Book's evolution from earlier Air Force studies. Previous investigations had suffered from inadequate scientific input and predetermined conclusions that served public relations more than genuine understanding. This new approach would emphasize thorough investigation, qualified analysis, and conclusions based on evidence rather than institutional preferences. Ruppelt led Hynek through rooms where civilian analysts and military personnel worked at metal desks covered with witness statements, photographs, radar records, and technical reports. The atmosphere combined the focused intensity of a research laboratory with the systematic documentation methods of a legal investigation. Typewriter keys clicked steadily as secretaries transcribed interview recordings, while technicians examined photographs through magnifying equipment, and analysts plotted flight paths on aeronautical charts. The case files themselves revealed the scope and complexity of the phenomena under investigation. Witnesses ranged from military pilots with thousands of flight hours to civilian observers with technical backgrounds that enabled detailed descriptions of unusual aerial behavior. Reports described objects that maneuvered in ways that violated conventional understanding of aerodynamics, propulsion, and structural engineering. Hynek examined several cases that had resisted conventional explanation despite thorough investigation. A formation of objects tracked by multiple radar installations had demonstrated speed and directional changes that exceeded known aircraft capabilities. Military pilots had reported pursuing craft that accelerated beyond any propulsion system in the American or Soviet inventory. Photographic evidence, while limited, occasionally showed objects with characteristics that challenged easy dismissal as conventional aircraft or atmospheric phenomena. The astronomer's scientific training helped him identify the most significant aspects of each case. Witness credibility mattered enormously. Reports from experienced pilots, air traffic controllers, and radar operators carried more weight than accounts from untrained observers. Multiple witness incidents provided opportunities for verification and cross-reference that single observer cases lacked. Technical data from instruments offered the kind of measurable evidence that scientists valued most highly. Ruppelt emphasized the importance of eliminating conventional explanations before considering more exotic possibilities. Weather phenomena, experimental aircraft, astronomical objects, and optical illusions accounted for the majority of reported sightings. The challenge lay in recognizing when thorough investigation had exhausted conventional possibilities without reaching satisfactory conclusions. The captain showed Hynek the project's classification system for cases. Identified reports received explanations that satisfied the available evidence. Insufficient data cases lacked enough information for reliable analysis. The troubling category was unidentified. Cases where investigation had eliminated conventional explanations without finding satisfactory alternatives. These unidentified cases troubled Hynek most deeply. His scientific training demanded logical explanations based on known physical principles, yet some reports seemed to describe phenomena that operated according to unfamiliar rules. Objects that made no sound despite visible movement through the atmosphere. Craft that demonstrated accelerations that should have destroyed any conceivable structure or occupants. Lights that appeared solid to radar while remaining invisible to optical observation. As afternoon faded toward evening, Hynek found himself facing questions that his astronomical experience hadn't prepared him to answer. The universe was vast and largely unexplored, certainly, but it presumably operated according to consistent physical laws.
These reports suggested either remarkable advances in human technology or phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible within the constraints of known science. The drive back to his hotel took him through Dayton's quiet residential neighborhoods, where families were settling into their evening routines behind lighted windows. Above them, the same sky that had witnessed these puzzling events stretched toward stars whose light represented the farthest frontier of human knowledge. Perhaps, Hynek thought, the frontier had moved closer to Earth than anyone had imagined.
Chapter 3. Lights over the Capitol. The July night in 1952 settled over Washington, D.C. with the humid stillness that marks summer in the nation's capital. At Washington National Airport, air traffic controllers began their routine shift monitoring the glowing blips that represented commercial and military aircraft moving through restricted airspace above the seat of American government. The radar screens in the darkened control tower showed the normal pattern of aviation activity, predictable, regulated, comprehensible. Then, the impossible began to unfold. Senior Controller Harry Barnes noticed the first anomalous returns at 11:40 p.m. 7 objects appeared on his radar scope, moving through prohibited airspace above the White House and Capitol building at speeds that oscillated between conventional aircraft velocity and accelerations that defied known propulsion systems. The blips moved in formation, then scattered individually, then reformed in configurations that suggested coordinated behavior rather than random. Barnes called his supervisor, who confirmed the returns on multiple radar systems. The objects weren't equipment malfunctions or atmospheric anomalies. They represented solid targets moving through controlled airspace with flight characteristics that violated every principle of conventional aviation. When military interceptors were scrambled to investigate, the mysterious returns vanished from radar screens, only to reappear after the fighter aircraft returned to base. Over the following weeks, reports of these extraordinary radar contacts would reach Hynek's desk at Wright Patterson, accompanied by testimonies from experienced air traffic personnel whose credibility couldn't be questioned. The astronomer found himself confronting evidence that challenged his systematic skepticism more profoundly than any previous case. The Washington incidents represented everything that made the UFO phenomenon scientifically troubling. Multiple trained observers had witnessed the same events using calibrated instruments designed to track aerial objects with precision. The radar returns indicated objects that maneuvered in ways that exceeded known aircraft capabilities. Yet they produced no sonic booms, no visible exhausts, no radio communications that might identify their origin or purpose. Hynek traveled to Washington to interview the air traffic controllers personally. He found professionals whose careers depended on accurate assessment of aerial phenomena, men who understood radar systems intimately and could distinguish between equipment anomalies and genuine targets. Their descriptions remain consistent across separate interviews, objects that moved with purposeful intelligence through airspace that should have been impossible to penetrate undetected. The political implications of objects violating restricted airspace above government buildings created pressures that Hynek hadn't encountered in purely scientific investigations. Military officials needed explanations that wouldn't compromise national security credibility, while media attention demanded answers that satisfied public curiosity without creating panic. The astronomer found himself caught between scientific methodology and institutional requirements that sometimes conflicted with thorough investigation. Barnes provided Hynek with detailed technical specifications of the radar contacts. The objects had demonstrated speeds exceeding 7,000 miles per hour.
then stopped instantaneously without apparent deceleration phases that would be required by any known technology. They had appeared solid to radar waves while remaining invisible to optical observation, suggesting characteristics that defied conventional understanding of matter and energy. The temperature inversion theory emerged as the official explanation. Atmospheric conditions that could theoretically create false radar returns resembling solid objects. Hynek examined meteorological data from the nights in question and found conditions that might support such interpretations. Yet the precision and coordination of the radar contacts suggested phenomena more complex than random atmospheric effects. Interview with radar operators at nearby Andrews Air Force Base revealed similar sightings during the same time periods. Their equipment had tracked objects that appeared to respond to the approach of interceptor aircraft, accelerating beyond pursuit capability whenever military planes attempted interception. The correlation between multiple radar installations eliminated the possibility of localized equipment malfunctions. Hynek's analysis revealed the fundamental challenge that cases like Washington would present throughout his Blue Book tenure. The evidence suggested phenomena that operated according to principles outside current scientific understanding. Yet the implications of accepting such conclusions extended beyond academic curiosity. If unknown objects could penetrate restricted airspace at will, demonstrate superior performance capabilities, and evade military interception, then fundamental assumptions about national security and technological supremacy required reconsideration. The astronomer found himself beginning to develop subtle cracks. His scientific training demanded explanations based on known physical laws, yet some evidence seemed to point toward possibilities that stretched conventional understanding. The Washington incidents weren't isolated events, but part of a pattern of reports from credible observers who described similar phenomena across different geographic locations and time periods. As Hynek prepared his official report on the Washington sightings, he chose his words carefully. The temperature inversion explanation provided a plausible, conventional interpretation that satisfied institutional requirements, while acknowledging that some aspects of the radar contacts remained unexplained. It was a compromise between scientific honesty and bureaucratic necessity. Yet privately, the astronomer began to suspect that conventional explanations might prove inadequate to understanding the full scope of phenomena being reported to Project Blue Book. The Washington incidents had demonstrated that whatever was causing these radar returns possessed capabilities that exceeded known human technology. Whether those capabilities represented advances by foreign nations, secret American experiments, or something more extraordinary remained an open question. The summer heat continued to settle over the capital as Hynek returned to Wright Patterson, carrying with him radar data that would influence his thinking for years to come. Above the monuments and government buildings of Washington, the night sky appeared calm and empty, revealing no trace of the mysterious objects that had challenged the certainties of science and security alike.
Chapter 4. The Mantell Incident. The January afternoon sky stretched clear and cold above Fort Knox, Kentucky, as Captain Thomas Mantell climbed toward 25,000 feet in his P-51 Mustang fighter. Below him, the winter landscape of central Kentucky spread in frozen patterns of brown fields and bare trees, while ahead of him hung an object that would transform Project Blue Book's approach to military pilot encounters and cost Mantell his life in the pursuit of answers. The incident began at Godman Army Airfield, when the control tower received reports from Kentucky State Police of a large circular object moving slowly across the sky. Military personnel at the base confirmed visual contact with something that appeared metallic and enormous, estimated at several hundred feet in diameter. When Mantell's four-plane flight happened to be returning from a routine mission, ground control requested that the fighters investigate the unknown object. Hynek would later study the case files with particular attention to the sequence of decisions that led to tragedy. Mantell had reported visual contact with the object and began climbing in pursuit, describing it as metallic and of tremendous size. His wingmen, lacking oxygen equipment necessary for high-altitude flight, abandoned the chase at lower altitudes. Mantell continued climbing alone, determined to identify the mysterious craft. The last radio transmission from Captain Mantell came as he climbed through 22,000 feet, reporting that the object appeared to be moving away from him at tremendous speed. His aircraft was found crashed hours later in a farm field near Franklin, Kentucky, with Mantell killed in the impact. The official investigation concluded that he had suffered oxygen deprivation at high altitude and lost consciousness, causing his plane to enter an uncontrolled dive. The Air Force initially classified the case as pilot error, suggesting that Mantell had chased the planet Venus, or possibly a high-altitude balloon. But Venus wasn't visible during daylight hours at the time of the sighting, and weather balloons didn't match the size and appearance descriptions provided by multiple ground observers. The explanation satisfied bureaucratic requirements without addressing the fundamental questions raised by the incident. For Hynek, the Mantell case represented the troubling intersection of UFO phenomena with military operations. An experienced pilot had died while pursuing an unknown object that multiple trained observers had witnessed. The conventional explanations offered by his Air Force colleagues seemed inadequate when measured against the testimony of credible witnesses who had observed the same object from different locations. The astronomer traveled to Kentucky to interview surviving witnesses and examine the crash site. Ground personnel at Godman described an object that reflected sunlight like polished metal and moved with purposeful direction rather than drifting passively like a weather balloon. The descriptions matched no known atmospheric phenomenon, and the object's apparent ability to accelerate away from pursuit suggested controlled flight rather than passive drift. The astronomer interviewed crash investigators and examined technical data from Mantell's aircraft. The wreckage showed evidence of high-speed impact, but no signs of structural failure or engine malfunction that might have caused the accident. Mantell had been an experienced pilot with hundreds of hours of flight, unlikely to make elementary errors in judgment about aircraft limitations or oxygen requirements. What troubled Hynek most was the institutional response to the tragedy. Rather than conducting thorough investigation into the object that had prompted Mantell's fatal pursuit, Air Force officials seemed more concerned with providing explanations that avoided uncomfortable questions about unknown aerial phenomena. The Venus explanation couldn't withstand serious scrutiny, yet it satisfied bureaucratic requirements for closure. The case forced Hynek to confront the human cost of UFO encounters. A dedicated military officer had died while attempting to identify an unknown object in American airspace. Whether that object represented foreign technology, atmospheric phenomena, or something more extraordinary, it deserved investigation proportional to its potential significance. Instead, the official response suggested institutional discomfort with mysteries that resisted conventional explanation.
Chapter 5. A pattern emerges. By 1955, Hynek's filing cabinets at Wright Patterson contained thousands of case reports that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation, but troubling to systematic analysis. The astronomer had developed classification methods that sorted incidents by witness credibility, environmental conditions, and duration of observation, creating a database that challenged his initial assumptions about the UFO phenomenon. The most compelling cases shared common characteristics that defied easy dismissal. Multiple witnesses provided corroborating testimony about objects that maneuvered in ways that exceeded known aircraft capabilities. Professional observers, pilots, air traffic controllers, radar operators described flight patterns that violated conventional understandings of aerodynamics and propulsion. Photographic evidence, while limited, occasionally captured objects with characteristics that resisted identification as conventional aircraft or atmospheric phenomena. Hynek found himself documenting encounters that occurred in daylight with excellent visibility, eliminating explanations based on misidentified celestial objects or optical illusions. Radar confirmations provided technical data that supported visual observations, creating a foundation of evidence that his scientific training couldn't easily dismiss. The geographic distribution of reports suggested global phenomena rather than localized atmospheric conditions or regional psychological factors. The McMinnville photographs presented Hynek with physical evidence that challenged his analytical framework. Paul and Evelyn Trent had captured images of a disc-shaped object above their Oregon farm using a simple camera that recorded details visible to enhanced examination. The photograph showed consistent shadows and light angles that supported the witness's account of timing and location. Analysis revealed an object with characteristics that didn't match known aircraft silhouettes or conventional explanations. The disk appeared metallic and structured, with proportions that suggested deliberate engineering rather than random atmospheric phenomena. While photographic evidence remained vulnerable to hoax allegations, the Trents' rural background and lack of apparent motive for deception added credibility to their testimony. The pattern extended beyond individual incidents to encompass behavioral characteristics that suggested intelligence behind the phenomena. Objects appeared to respond to human presence, accelerating when approached by military aircraft or altering course when observed by ground witnesses. The responses implied awareness and decision-making capabilities that exceeded what atmospheric phenomena or conventional aircraft would demonstrate. Hynek began categorizing encounters based on proximity and interaction level. Distant sightings provided observational data but limited detail. Close encounters revealed structural features and behavioral patterns that offered more significant evidence. The closest encounters involved apparent awareness of human observers, suggesting that whatever produced these phenomena possessed both advanced technology and interest in human activities. Chapter 6. The Socorro Incident. 850 words. The spring afternoon in Socorro, New Mexico, carried the high desert clarity that made distant mountains seem close enough to touch when Police Sergeant Lonnie Zamora spotted smoke rising from an arroyo south of town on April 24, 1964. Zamora had been pursuing a speeding motorist when the distant plume caught his attention, suggesting perhaps a dynamite shack explosion or overturned vehicle that required immediate investigation. the veteran officer abandoned his traffic chase and drove toward what he assumed would be a routine emergency response. What Zamora discovered in that remote New Mexico gully would provide Hynek with one of the most compelling cases in Project Blue Book's files. The police sergeant's testimony, backed by physical evidence and corroborating witnesses, challenged the astronomer's analytical framework more profoundly than any previous investigation. Zamora described approaching the arroyo and observing a white, egg-shaped object approximately the size of a sedan, supported by thin metallic legs that held it several feet above the ground. Two figures in white coveralls moved around the craft's base, though Zamora couldn't distinguish detailed features from his initial observation distance. When his patrol car engine stalled, the figures appeared to notice him, quickly entering the object before it lifted vertically with a roaring sound that faded to silence as it gained altitude. The physical evidence that awaited Hynek's investigation distinguished the Socorro incident from purely testimonial cases. Deep impressions in the hard-packed desert earth showed where the object's landing gear had pressed into soil. Burned vegetation surrounded the landing site in patterns that suggested intense heat applied from above. Metal fragments scattered nearby appeared to be fresh residue from some kind of propulsion system. Hynek traveled to Socorro within days of the incident to interview Zamora and examine the landing site personally. The police sergeant impressed him as a reliable witness whose career depended on accurate observation and reporting. Zamora had no history of UFO interest or claims, no apparent motive for fabrication, and everything to lose professionally by reporting something that might damage his credibility with colleagues and superiors. The astronomer documented the physical traces with scientific rigor that his training demanded. The landing impressions showed precise geometric spacing that suggested a structured object rather than random impact patterns. Chemical analysis of soil samples revealed composition changes consistent with exposure to temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The burn patterns on vegetation appeared too localized and intense for conventional explanations like lightning strikes or brush fires. Corroborating witnesses strengthened the case significantly. A tourist family traveling through Socorro had observed a bright object moving rapidly above the desert at approximately the time Zamora reported his encounter. A local gas station attendant had noticed unusual aerial activity in the same general direction. The convergence of independent testimonies from different locations provided the kind of verification that serious investigation required. The Air Force response to Socorro revealed institutional patterns that troubled Hynek increasingly. Rather than conducting thorough analysis of the physical evidence, officials seemed more interested in finding conventional explanations that would close the case quickly. Theories ranging from experimental aircraft tests to elaborate hoaxes were proposed without adequate supporting evidence or serious consideration of the data that contradicted such explanations. Hynek found himself defending the quality of evidence that his scientific training told him deserved serious attention. The Socorro case combined credible witness testimony with measurable physical traces and multiple confirmations from independent sources. If similar evidence had been presented in any other investigative context, it would have demanded thorough analysis rather than dismissal based on preconceived assumptions about what was possible. The incident marked a significant evolution in Hynek's approach to UFO investigation.
Previously, he had approached each case assuming that conventional explanation would emerge through systematic analysis. Socorro forced him to consider that some phenomena might represent genuinely unknown technology, operating according to principles outside current scientific understanding. The astronomer's growing frustration with institutional pressure to minimize unexplained cases began crystallizing around incidents like Socorro. Military officials and government administrators seemed more concerned with public relations than scientific methodology, preferring explanations that satisfied bureaucratic requirements rather than addressing the evidence comprehensively. Zamura's steadfast insistence on the accuracy of his report impressed Hynek despite official skepticism. The police sergeant had nothing to gain and much to lose by maintaining his account of events that challenged conventional understanding. His willingness to withstand ridicule and career consequences suggested the kind integrity that serious investigation required, but rarely encountered. The Socorro case also introduced Hynek to the human cost of UFO encounters beyond dramatic incidents like the Mantell crash. Witnesses like Zamora faced social stigma, professional challenges, and personal stress that came with reporting experiences that society couldn't easily accept or explain. The astronomer began recognizing the courage required to come forward with testimony about phenomena that challenged established assumptions. As Hynek prepared his official report on Socorro, he chose his words more carefully than ever before. The evidence pointed toward conclusions that his institutional position didn't permit him to express directly, yet his scientific conscience wouldn't allow him to dismiss findings that met rigorous investigative standards. The desert wind continued sweeping across the Socorro Arroyo long after the official investigation concluded, gradually erasing the physical traces that had documented one of the most compelling encounters in Project Blue Book's files.
Chapter 7: Swamp Gas and Public Pressure. The March evening in Michigan carried the sharp cold of late winter when reports began flooding into police stations across the state about brilliant lights maneuvering over rural farmland and suburban neighborhoods. What began as isolated sightings in Dexter and Hillsdale escalated into mass observations that would thrust Hynek into the most uncomfortable public spotlight of his career and forever associate his name with the phrase swamp gas. Over 40 witnesses in the Dexter area reported seeing a glowing disc-shaped object hovering near a farm owned by Frank Manor. The object appeared to land in a swampy area behind the farmhouse, prompting Manor and his son to investigate on foot. They described approaching within 500 yards of a football-shaped craft that pulsed with red, white, and blue lights before ascending silently and disappearing into the night sky. Similar reports emerged from Hillsdale College, where dormitory residents and college officials observed strange lights moving over the campus for several hours. The witnesses included the college dean, who watched through binoculars as the objects maneuvered in patterns that suggested controlled flight rather than natural phenomena. Students gathered in dormitory windows, some taking photographs that would later prove too blurred for analysis, but captured the excitement of mass observation. The Michigan incident created exactly the kind of public attention that Air Force officials dreaded. News media descended on the small farming communities, interviewing witnesses and broadcasting accounts that reached national audiences hungry for UFO stories. Congressional representatives from Michigan demanded explanations, threatening hearings if the Air Force couldn't provide satisfactory answers quickly. Hynek arrived in Michigan under enormous pressure to resolve the cases with conventional explanations that would satisfy both military superiors and congressional critics. The astronomer had barely 24 hours to investigate complex incidents involving dozens of witnesses spread across multiple locations. His usual methodical approach to case analysis became impossible under the glare of media attention and political demands for immediate closure. The pressure intensified during a packed press conference at the University of Michigan, where Hynek faced reporters demanding explanations for sightings that had captured national attention. Television cameras recorded his every word as he struggled to balance scientific honesty with institutional requirements for conventional conclusions. The Air Force needed answers that would end the controversy, not fuel additional speculation about unexplained phenomena. Under this pressure, Hynek offered the explanation that would haunt his reputation for years to come. He suggested that the witnesses might have observed swamp gas, methane emissions from decaying organic matter that could create glowing effects under certain atmospheric conditions. The explanation provided the conventional solution that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while acknowledging unusual atmospheric phenomena that witnesses had genuinely observed. The public reaction to the swamp gas explanation proved devastating for both Hynek and Project Blue Book's credibility. Witnesses who had observed structured craft with visible details felt insulted by suggestions that they had misidentified natural gas emissions. Congressional representatives dismissed the explanation as inadequate, with some questioning whether the Air Force was concealing more significant information about the incidents. Media coverage portrayed Hynek as either incompetent scientist who couldn't recognize obvious aircraft or a government spokesman who deliberately obscured truth with ridiculous explanations. Editorial cartoons depicted him surrounded by swamps and gas clouds, while serious journalists questioned whether Project Blue Book served scientific investigation or public relations damage control. The Michigan incident marked a turning point in Hynek's relationship with both Project Blue Book and his own scientific conscience. The pressure to provide instant explanations for complex phenomena violated every principle of methodical investigation that his training had taught him to value. The astronomer began recognizing the impossible position that institutional requirements created for legitimate scientific inquiry. Frank Manor and other witnesses continued insisting on the accuracy of their observations despite official explanations that minimized their experiences. The farmer maintained that he had observed a structured craft at close range, not natural gas emissions that wouldn't explain the object's apparent solidity, lighting patterns, or controlled movements. His persistence in face of official skepticism impressed Hynek as evidence of genuine conviction, rather than attention-seeking behavior. The swamp gas controversy also revealed the growing gap between Project Blue Book's public mission and its actual investigative methods. Media attention exposed the superficial analysis that bureaucratic pressures forced upon complex cases requiring extensive investigation. The 24-hour deadline for explaining the Michigan incident demonstrated priorities that served public relations rather than scientific understanding. Letters from colleagues in the scientific community reflected the professional damage that the swamp gas explanation caused to Hynek's reputation. Fellow astronomers questioned how someone of his caliber could offer such an inadequate explanation for phenomena that clearly deserved more thorough analysis. The incident threatened his standing at Northwestern University and his credibility within professional organizations. Yet the Michigan controversy also strengthened Hynek's resolve to pursue more independent approaches to UFO investigation. The institutional pressures that had forced the swamp gas explanation convinced him that legitimate scientific inquiry required freedom from bureaucratic requirements for convenient conclusions. The astronomer began considering whether truth-seeking might require stepping outside official channels.
As spring returned to Michigan and the media attention faded, Hynek continued receiving letters from witnesses who maintained the accuracy of their observations despite official explanations that dismissed their experiences. Their persistence reminded him that scientific investigation served truth rather than convenience, regardless of the political pressures that might prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable questions. The swamp gas incident became a lesson in the incompatibility between genuine scientific inquiry and institutional demands for predetermined conclusions, marking Hynek's evolution from government consultant toward independent researcher committed to following evidence wherever it might lead.
Chapter 8. The Classification System. By 1966, the accumulation of case files in Hynek's Wright Patterson office had created a catalog of human encounters with the unknown that demanded systematic organization. The astronomer found himself confronting thousands of reports that shared common characteristics, yet varied dramatically in detail, credibility, and proximity to witnesses. The need for a classification system became apparent, not just for administrative convenience, but for scientific understanding of patterns that might reveal the true nature of these phenomena. Hynek's scientific training had taught him that classification systems served as essential tools for recognizing relationships between apparently separate observations. In astronomy, stellar classification had revealed evolutionary patterns and physical properties that transformed understanding of cosmic processes. Perhaps a systematic approach to UFO encounters might yield similar insights into phenomena that remained frustratingly opaque when examined as isolated incidents. The classification system that emerged from Hynek's analysis would become his most lasting contribution to UFO research. Rather than focusing on the objects themselves, which often defied consistent description, he chose to categorize encounters based on the distance between witnesses and phenomenon. This approach emphasized the quality of observational data while acknowledging that closer encounters provided more detailed information for analysis. Distant sightings, which Hynek designated as nocturnal lights or daylight disks, offered limited detail, but occurred most frequently in the case files. These observations provided valuable statistical data about geographical distribution, timing patterns, and general behavioral characteristics. While individual distant sightings rarely yielded definitive conclusions, their aggregate patterns suggested systematic rather than random phenomena. The breakthrough in Hynek's thinking came with his recognition that proximity dramatically affected the quality and significance of witness testimony. Encounters where witnesses claimed to observe structured craft at distances closer than 500 feet offered details about surface features, propulsion systems, and apparent technological characteristics that distant observations couldn't provide. These close encounters, as Hynek termed them, fell into three distinct categories based on the level of interaction between witnesses and phenomena. Close encounters of the first kind involved detailed observation of craft without additional physical evidence. Witnesses reported seeing structured objects with apparent technological features, but the encounters left no measurable traces for subsequent investigation. Close encounters of the second kind included physical evidence that could be examined scientifically. Landing traces, electromagnetic effects on equipment, burn marks on vegetation, or residual radiation provided measurable data that extended beyond witness testimony. These cases offered the kind of evidence that scientific investigation required, though the evidence often proved difficult to interpret conclusively. The third category represented the most controversial and significant classification in Hynek's system. Close encounters of the third kind involved reports of beings associated with the observed craft.
These encounters stretched credibility most severely, yet they occurred frequently enough in the case files to demand systematic consideration rather than automatic dismissal. Hynek's classification system reflected his evolution from a scientist who assumed conventional explanations would emerge through thorough analysis to a researcher who recognized that some phenomena might represent genuinely unknown technology. The system provided a framework for organizing evidence without prejudicing conclusions about the ultimate nature of the phenomena being investigated. The practical value of the classification system became apparent as Hynek applied it to analyze patterns in the accumulated case files. Close encounters occurred less frequently than distant sightings, but provided proportionally more significant evidence for investigation. Geographic clustering of encounters suggested that certain areas experienced repeated activity rather than random distribution of events. Temporal patterns also emerged through systematic analysis. Some locations reported encounters during specific time periods, suggesting systematic rather than accidental presence of whatever was causing the phenomena. The patterns didn't match known military exercises, atmospheric conditions, or astronomical events that might provide conventional explanations for the reported activities. The classification system also revealed the limitations of conventional investigative approaches that focused on debunking individual cases rather than recognizing broader patterns. When analyzed systematically, the close encounters showed consistencies that suggested common origins rather than independent misidentifications of conventional objects or psychological phenomena. Witness credibility correlated strongly with encounter classification, with close encounter reports more likely to come from observers whose professional backgrounds involved technical training or responsibility for accurate observation. Police officers, pilots, radar operators, and military personnel reported close encounters at rates that exceeded their representation in the general population. The development of the classification system marked Hynek's intellectual independence from institutional pressures that demanded predetermined conclusions. By focusing on observational characteristics rather than theoretical explanations, the system provided tools for scientific analysis without requiring premature acceptance of conclusions that exceeded available evidence. As Hynek refined his classification system through application to hundreds of cases, he began recognizing that the close encounter reports formed a coherent pattern that suggested systematic investigation of human activities by intelligences possessing advanced technological capabilities. The implications of such a conclusion extended far beyond scientific curiosity into fundamental questions about humanity's place in the universe. The classification system would survive Project Blue Book's termination and become the foundation for civilian UFO research that continued after official investigations ended. Its emphasis on observational data rather than theoretical speculation provided a framework that serious researchers could use to distinguish significant cases from the majority of reports that yielded to conventional explanation. Standing in his office, surrounded by carefully classified case files, Hynek contemplated the patterns that systematic analysis had revealed and wondered whether the framework he had developed might eventually contribute to understanding one of the most profound mysteries in human experience.
Chapter 9. Military Tensions. The late 1960s brought increasing friction between Hynek's scientific methodology and the institutional pressures that governed Project Blue Book's operations. Air Force officials, facing congressional scrutiny and public criticism, demanded explanations for UFO cases that would satisfy political requirements rather than scientific standards. The astronomer found himself caught between his professional integrity and bureaucratic demands that threatened to compromise the investigation he had spent decades building. The pressure manifested most clearly in case review meetings, where military administrators pushed for conventional explanations regardless of evidence quality. Reports that deserved thorough investigation were rushed to closure with explanations that satisfied immediate political needs but ignored troubling details that resisted conventional interpretation. Hynek watched experienced investigators reduce complex cases to simple categories that served public relations better than scientific understanding. Colonel Hector Quintanilla, who had replaced the methodical Captain Ruppelt as Project Blue Book director, embodied the institutional shift toward damage control rather than genuine investigation. Quintanilla's approach emphasized closing cases quickly, with explanations that minimized the phenomenon's significance, even when evidence suggested more thorough analysis was warranted. The colonel's military background had prepared him for clear mission parameters and definitive conclusions, neither of which the UFO phenomenon seemed willing to provide. The clash between scientific methodology and military requirements became particularly acute in cases involving close encounters with apparent physical evidence. Hynek's training demanded systematic analysis of landing traces, electromagnetic effects, and witness testimony, using rigorous standards that might require months of investigation. Military administrators needed explanations within days that would satisfy congressional inquiries and media demands for immediate answers. Budget constraints further complicated the investigation process, as Air Force officials reduced resources allocated to case analysis while maintaining public expectations for thorough investigation. Field investigators found themselves forced to conduct abbreviated inquiries that missed critical evidence or witness testimony. Laboratory analysis of physical traces became limited to basic tests that couldn't determine whether unusual materials or energy effects required more sophisticated examination. The astronomer's growing frustration with these limitations began affecting his relationship with military colleagues who had once respected his scientific approach to unexplained cases. Staff meetings became exercises in diplomatic disagreement, as Hynek advocated for more thorough investigation, while administrators pushed for faster closure rates that would demonstrate the project's efficiency to Pentagon oversight. Personnel changes within Project Blue Book reflected the institutional priorities that increasingly emphasized public relations over scientific investigation. Experienced analysts who understood the complexity of UFO phenomena were replaced by staff members whose primary qualification was their willingness to find conventional explanations for cases that previous investigators had classified as genuinely unexplained. The quality of official explanations declined accordingly, as new personnel applied predetermined conclusions rather than systematic analysis to incoming reports. Weather balloons became the default explanation for daylight disk sightings, regardless of witness descriptions or environmental conditions. Venus became responsible for nocturnal light reports, without reference to astronomical data that might contradict such assignments. Hynek found himself increasingly isolated within an institution that had once valued his scientific expertise, but now viewed his methodical approach as an obstacle to efficient case closure. His insistence on thorough analysis conflicted with administrative requirements for rapid resolution of cases that attracted public attention or congressional interest.
The breaking point came during a heated discussion about the Socorro incident, which Hynek continued to classify as unexplained, despite pressure to provide conventional explanations that would close the case definitively. Military officials argued that Zamora's testimony, however credible, couldn't justify maintaining an unexplained classification that implied Air Force's inability to identify objects in American airspace. This conversation revealed fundamental disagreements about Project Blue Book's mission that had been developing for years beneath professional courtesy and shared institutional loyalty. Hynek believed the project should serve scientific understanding of genuine, unexplained phenomena. Military administrators believed it should demonstrate Air Force competence in protecting American airspace from identifiable threats, while reassuring the public that unusual sightings pose no danger. These competing priorities created an impossible situation for serious scientific investigation. Cases that might contribute to understanding unusual phenomena were pressure-cooked into conventional explanations that satisfied bureaucratic requirements without addressing the evidence that made them scientifically interesting. The project had evolved from investigating UFO reports to explaining them away. Congressional representatives added another layer of pressure by demanding briefings that demonstrated effective use of taxpayer money for practical national security purposes. The nuanced uncertainty that characterized legitimate scientific investigation didn't satisfy politicians who needed clear answers for their constituents. Project Blue Book's survival depended on providing the kind of definitive conclusions that the evidence rarely supported. As 1968 approached, Hynek realized that his role as scientific consultant had become largely ceremonial. His recommendations for thorough investigation were regularly overruled by administrators who prioritized rapid case closure over accurate analysis. The institution that had once provided him with fascinating investigative challenges had become a bureaucratic exercise in predetermined conclusions. Hynek began considering whether his scientific integrity required stepping away from an investigation that no longer served the truth-seeking purposes that originally attracted him to the work. Standing at his office window, overlooking Wright Patterson's runways, Hynek contemplated whether genuine UFO research might require abandoning official channels that had become obstacles to, rather than facilitators, of scientific understanding.
Chapter 10. The Weight of Evidence. December 17, 1969, marked the end of Project Blue Book and the conclusion of Hynek's official involvement with military UFO investigations. Secretary of the Air Force Robert C. Siemens, Jr. announced the program's termination with a memorandum stating that continuation cannot be justified either on the ground of national security or in the interest of science. After 17 years and 12,618 investigated cases, the longest systematic study of UFO phenomena in American history officially concluded. Hynek stood in his Wright Patterson office, surrounded by filing cabinets that contained 2 decades of human encounters with the unknown. The final statistics told a story that complicated the Air Force's official conclusions. Of the thousands of reports investigated, 701 cases remained genuinely unidentified, despite thorough analysis using the best investigative methods available to the military and scientific communities. The Condon Report, prepared by the University of Colorado under Dr. Edward Condon's direction, had provided the scientific justification for terminating Project Blue Book. The report concluded that UFOs posed no threat to national security, represented no unknown technology beyond current scientific understanding, and provided no evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. These conclusions satisfied bureaucratic requirements for closure, while effectively ending government-sponsored UFO research. Yet Hynek's personal analysis of the accumulated evidence revealed patterns that the official conclusions seemed to overlook or minimize. The 701 unexplained cases included reports from highly credible witnesses describing phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of aerodynamics, propulsion, and material science. Military pilots, air traffic controllers, radar operators, and other trained observers had documented encounters that resisted identification despite exhaustive investigation. The classification system that Hynek had developed revealed significant patterns among the unexplained cases. Close encounters provided detailed descriptions of structured craft with apparent technological features that didn't match any known aircraft in American or foreign inventories. Physical traces left at landing sites included ground impressions, burned vegetation, and residual materials that scientific analysis couldn't explain through conventional means. Multiple witness cases offered the kind of corroboration that scientific investigation valued most highly. When independent observers from different locations reported the same phenomena simultaneously, the possibility of misidentification or psychological factors decreased significantly. Radar confirmations of visual sightings provided technical data that supported witness testimony with measurable evidence. The geographic and temporal distribution of unexplained cases suggested systematic rather than random phenomena. Certain areas experienced repeated encounters over extended periods, implying ongoing activity rather than isolated incidents. The patterns didn't correlate with known atmospheric conditions, military exercises, or astronomical events that might provide conventional explanations. Hynek's scientific training demanded honest assessment of evidence regardless of its implications for established theories or institutional preferences. The data from Project Blue Book's most compelling cases pointed toward phenomena that operated according to principles outside current scientific understanding. Whether those principles represented advances in human technology or something more extraordinary remained an open question that deserved continued investigation. The institutional pressures that had influenced Project Blue Book's conclusions troubled Hynek more than the mysteries themselves. Military requirements for definitive answers had often forced premature closure of cases that merited extended investigation. Political considerations about public confidence and congressional oversight had shaped conclusions more than evidence quality or scientific methodology. The astronomer recognized that legitimate scientific inquiry required freedom from bureaucratic constraints that predetermined acceptable conclusions. Truth-seeking couldn't be subordinated to institutional convenience or political requirements without compromising the integrity of the investigative process. His experience with Project Blue Book had taught him that genuine understanding of UFO phenomena might require independent research outside official channels. As he prepared to leave his Wright Patterson office for the final time, Hynek contemplated the transformation his UFO investigations had produced in his scientific worldview. He had begun as a skeptical astronomer, confident that conventional explanations would emerge through systematic analysis.
17 years of evidence had taught him humility about the limits of current scientific knowledge and the possibility that reality might be more complex than established theories suggested. The close encounter cases particularly challenged his assumptions about the nature of intelligence and technology in the universe. If the most compelling reports accurately described structured craft with advanced capabilities, then humanity might not be alone in developing technological civilization. The implications extended far beyond scientific curiosity into fundamental questions about humanity's place in the cosmos. The decision to establish an independent research organization had been developing in Hynek's mind for months as Project Blue Book's limitations became increasingly apparent. The Center for UFO Studies would provide a framework for continued investigation using scientific methodology without institutional constraints that might compromise objective analysis. The organization would focus on cases that official investigations had been unable to resolve satisfactorily. The final Project Blue Book report contained statistics that documented both the scope of UFO phenomena and the limitations of official investigation. Over 12,000 reported cases represented thousands of witnesses who had encountered something they couldn't identify using conventional knowledge. While the majority of reports had yielded to conventional explanation, the unexplained cases formed a coherent pattern that suggested systematic phenomena deserving scientific attention. Standing at his office window, overlooking the Wright Patterson flight line where military aircraft prepared for routine missions, Hynek reflected on the irony that the most profound mysteries of flight remained unsolved despite decades of investigation by the world's most advanced aviation organization.
Chapter 11. Project Termination. The official announcement came on December 17, 1969, with the bureaucratic precision that characterized military communications. Secretary of the Air Force Robert C. Seamans, Jr. released a memorandum stating that Project Blue Book would be terminated effective immediately, concluding that continued investigation of UFO reports cannot be justified either on the ground of national security or in the interest of science. The decision represented the culmination of institutional pressures that had been building throughout the 1960s as Project Blue Book struggled to satisfy competing demands from Congress, the media, and the scientific community. The Condon Committee report, officially titled The Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects, had provided the academic justification needed to end government involvement in UFO research, despite unresolved questions about the most compelling cases. Hynek received the news without surprise, having watched Project Blue Book evolve from serious scientific investigation into what he privately described as a public relations exercise. The institutional constraints that had increasingly compromised the quality of investigation made termination almost inevitable. The Air Force needed closure on a phenomenon that resisted conventional explanation, and administrative efficiency demanded ending investigations that couldn't provide satisfactory answers. The final statistics told a complex story that official conclusions seemed to minimize. Of 12,618 reported cases investigated over 17 years, 11,917 had received conventional explanations that satisfied Project Blue Book's standards. But 701 cases remained classified as genuinely unidentified, despite thorough analysis using the best investigative methods available to military and scientific authorities. These unexplained cases included some of the most compelling reports in Project Blue Book's files.
Military pilots had described structured craft that maneuvered in ways that exceeded known aircraft capabilities. Radar operators had tracked objects that demonstrated speed and directional changes that violated conventional understanding of aerodynamics. Police officers had reported close encounters with apparent technological artifacts that left measurable physical traces. The geographic and temporal distribution of unexplained cases revealed patterns that suggested systematic rather than random phenomena. Certain locations had experienced repeated encounters over extended periods, implying ongoing activity rather than isolated incidents. The consistency of witness descriptions across different regions and time periods indicated coherent phenomena that deserved continued scientific attention. Hynek's personal analysis of the accumulated evidence had evolved significantly from his initial skepticism about UFO reports. The quality of witness testimony, the consistency of descriptions, and the physical evidence associated with close encounters had convinced him that some cases represented genuinely unknown phenomena that warranted serious scientific investigation outside official channels constrained by institutional priorities. The decision to terminate Project Blue Book reflected broader changes in American society and government that extended beyond UFO research. The Vietnam War had eroded public confidence in official explanations of complex phenomena. Congressional oversight of military programs had intensified following budget concerns and questions about institutional accountability. The space program had captured public imagination about possibilities beyond Earth, while demonstrating human technological limitations. Administrative pressures within the Air Force had made Project Blue Book increasingly dysfunctional as a scientific investigation. Budget constraints had reduced resources available for field investigations and laboratory analysis of physical evidence. Personnel changes had replaced experienced investigators with staff whose primary qualification was willingness to find conventional explanations for puzzling cases. The quality of official explanations had declined correspondingly, as institutional priorities emphasized rapid case closure over thorough analysis. Weather phenomena, astronomical objects, and conventional aircraft became default explanations, regardless of witness descriptions or environmental conditions that contradicted such assignments. The investigative process had become predetermined to reach conclusions that satisfied bureaucratic requirements rather than scientific standards. Colonel Hector Quintanilla, Project Blue Book's final director, embodied the institutional approach that prioritized public relations over genuine investigation. His military background had prepared him for clear mission parameters and definitive conclusions, neither of which the UFO phenomenon seemed willing to provide. The colonel's emphasis on rapid case closure conflicted with scientific methodology that demanded thorough analysis of anomalous data. The termination announcement emphasized conclusions that minimized the significance of unexplained cases, while highlighting the conventional explanations that applied to the majority of reports. UFOs posed no threat to national security, represented no unknown technology beyond current scientific understanding, and provided no evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. These conclusions satisfied institutional requirements while effectively ending government-sponsored UFO research. Yet Hynek's scientific analysis of the most compelling cases pointed toward conclusions that the official termination statement seemed to overlook. The unexplained reports formed coherent patterns that suggested phenomena operating according to principles outside current scientific understanding. Whether those phenomena represented advances in human technology or something more extraordinary remained an open question that deserved continued investigation. The irony of terminating investigations just as evidence suggested genuine mysteries deserving scientific attention was not lost on Hynek as he prepared to clear out his Wright Patterson office. The institution that had provided him with the most extensive collection of UFO data in history was abandoning the investigation just as patterns were emerging that might lead to significant understanding. Standing among the filing cabinets that contained 17 years of documented encounters with the unknown, Hynek contemplated the transformation his involvement with Project Blue Book had produced in his scientific worldview. He had begun as a confident skeptic, certain that conventional explanations would emerge through systematic analysis. The accumulated evidence had taught him humility about the limits of established knowledge and the possibility that reality might prove more complex than current theory suggested.
Chapter 12. Independent Inquiry. The winter of 1973 found Hynek in his Northwestern University office, surrounded by familiar filing cabinets that now contained copies of the most significant cases from his 17 years with Project Blue Book. Outside his window, the Illinois snow fell steadily across the quiet campus, creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere that encouraged deep contemplation. 4 years had passed since the Air Force terminated its official UFO investigations, but the questions that had emerged from those thousands of cases continued to demand answers from anyone committed to scientific truth. The Center for UFO Studies took shape gradually as Hynek corresponded with researchers around the world who shared his conviction that the unexplained cases deserved continued investigation using rigorous scientific methodology. Unlike Project Blue Book, which had operated under institutional constraints that prioritized public relations over accurate analysis, the center would focus exclusively on cases that resisted conventional explanation despite thorough investigation. The astronomer's reputation had evolved considerably since the swamp gas controversy that had damaged his credibility with both the public and the scientific community. His decision to pursue independent UFO research, despite professional risks, had gradually earned respect from colleagues who recognized his commitment to following evidence wherever it might lead. The center provided a framework for serious investigation without bureaucratic pressures that might compromise scientific integrity. Funding for the organization came from private donations and Hynek's personal resources, ensuring independence from government agencies or commercial interests that might influence research directions. The modest budget required careful prioritization of cases, focusing attention on encounters that offered the highest potential for advancing scientific understanding of unexplained phenomena. Quality of investigation mattered more than quantity of cases processed. The center's approach differed fundamentally from Project Blue Book's final years, when institutional pressure had forced rapid closure of cases using explanations that satisfied administrative requirements rather than scientific standards. Independent investigation allowed unlimited time for thorough analysis of physical evidence, extensive witness interviews, and consultation with specialists whose expertise might illuminate unusual aspects of specific cases. Field investigations resumed the methodical character that had marked Hynek's early work with Captain Reppelt, before bureaucratic constraints had compromised the quality of official inquiry. Investigators spent days or weeks at encounter sites, documenting physical traces, interviewing multiple witnesses, and examining environmental factors that might influence observations.
The systematic approach that scientific training demanded finally received time and resources necessary for legitimate implementation. The classification system that Hynek had developed during his Air Force years provided the organizational framework for analyzing cases collected by the center. Close encounters continued to offer the most significant evidence for scientific analysis, with proximity to witnesses providing details about apparent technological characteristics that distant observations couldn't reveal. The system enabled pattern recognition that might eventually contribute to understanding the underlying nature of UFO phenomena. International cooperation became possible as the center established contacts with researchers in countries whose governments had conducted their own UFO investigations or collected civilian reports through academic institutions. British, French, Canadian, and Australian researchers shared data that revealed global patterns similar to those Hynek had documented in American cases. The worldwide distribution of similar phenomena suggested systematic rather than localized activities. The quality of witnesses reporting close encounters remained consistently higher than random population samples would predict. Police officers, military personnel, pilots, and technical professionals continued to report structured craft with apparent advanced capabilities at rates exceeding their representation in the general population. Their professional backgrounds provided credibility that enhanced the scientific value of their testimony, while their technical training enabled more accurate descriptions of unusual phenomena. Physical evidence associated with close encounters received more sophisticated analysis than Project Blue Book's limited resources had permitted. University laboratories examined soil samples from landing sites. Metallurgical specialists analyzed unusual materials, and medical professionals evaluated physiological effects reported by witnesses. The expanded analytical capabilities occasionally revealed anomalies that suggested technologies outside current scientific understanding. The center's research gradually attracted attention from serious scientists who had previously avoided UFO research due to professional concerns about career implications. Physicists, engineers, and medical researchers contributed expertise that enhanced the quality of evidence analysis while maintaining the objective approach that distinguished scientific inquiry from sensational speculation. The growing involvement of qualified professionals validated Hynek's conviction that UFO phenomena deserved serious academic attention. Media coverage of the center's work emphasized scientific methodology rather than sensational aspects of UFO reports, helping to rehabilitate the subject's reputation within academic and professional communities. Hynek's careful presentation of evidence and conservative interpretation of findings demonstrated that UFO research could maintain regular standards while addressing genuinely puzzling phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. As the 1970s progressed, the accumulation of carefully investigated cases began revealing patterns that suggested systematic characteristics underlying UFO phenomena. Geographic clustering, temporal correlations, and behavioral consistencies implied organized activities rather than random occurrences. The patterns didn't match known human technologies, atmospheric conditions, or psychological factors that might provide conventional explanations. Standing at his office window, watching the snow fall across the northwestern campus, Hynek reflected on the transformation that UFO investigation had produced in his scientific worldview. The journey from confident skepticism to humble acknowledgement of mystery had taught him that the universe might contain possibilities that exceeded current theoretical frameworks. The Center for UFO Studies represented his commitment to pursuing those possibilities wherever serious investigation might lead. The questions that had emerged from 17 years of official investigation continued to demand answers from anyone committed to understanding rather than explaining away the unknown. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by evidence of humanity's encounters with mystery, Hynek continued the work that institutional constraints had once compromised but could never completely suppress.